Hi. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This is Uber Freight's Q1 market update. Really appreciate everyone taking the time out of your day, lunch hour to sit with us and talk a little bit of the industry and market and kind of what we're seeing from a carrier and procurement standpoint. Just a few additional things going on this quarter, probably that we hadn't seen in past. So we'll have the Q&A open, of course, and we'll try to answer anything we can. Mazen and I, will be leading you through this. My name's Nathan Adams. I'm the Vice President of Procurement and Carrier Management here at Uber Freight. Mazen is our Senior Applied Scientist. We usually try to make up a title for him, like, Economic Wizard or something. He didn't like that, but we try to give him a new title every market update. And so what will happen, I'll kind of kick us off and just talk through high level what we're seeing from like a modal standpoint, just any pressures, rate directional in the industry. I'll pass it off to Mazen, we'll jump right into versus an economic update. We're going to jump right into what we're considering market disruption. So we'll hit tariffs and fuel and all the things that are going on in the world that were headwinds in the business, and then we'll wrap it up with a little bit of what we're seeing from the carrier side. Again, impacts from the new regulations coming out, so on and so forth. So we expect it to be pretty packed, pretty informational, and again, Q&A will be open, so please ask your questions there. The broader market report, which is a much deeper version that what we're going to show today, is also published out there. So please make sure you get out there and get that whole report. So we'll just kind of jump in from there. So again, I introduce myself and Mazen, and again, we're excited to be here. So just high level markets at a glance. I'm not going to hit on every one of these. I'm just going to hit on a few that I think are probably most prevalent. And then each of these sections again are going to have a deeper dive in the broader update. So please, if you have questions under any of these that we don't get to today, please reference that report, and if not, ask your Uber Freight representative. But overall, I'd say I'm going to hit on truckload first. Spots coming down, but man, it's still way up there, right? So we're still over 25% year over year in spot. It's still a lot of spot pressure, even though we're saying, hey, spot's easing. It's still very, very high year over year, and we're all starting to see that in our tender accept metrics. So typically we run in those mid to low 90s from a first tender accept percent, and we're in those 85 high 80s right now. So definitely seeing some tightening. A lot of that was due to the weather, but still, it still seems to be some real market tightening in the space, which is a lot different than we've been talking about the past, probably at least four reports, maybe 6 reports. Secondly, I'd like to hit on LTL and just the pressures in there. We're still seeing the rates elevated there. A little bit of a different network, stagnant, or we have a staple amount of capacity, and so those rates are going to reflect that, and we're still seeing elevated rates year over year. Lastly, I will call it intermodal. Starting to see a little bit of pressure there. As we know, like truck prices increase, like intermodal becomes more of an option, right? Both from a fuel standpoint and a line haul standpoint. We know as the trucking rates increase, like I said, a lot of shippers are going to start looking and see, okay, can I put intermodal in the business? Can I do any shifting around from that standpoint? So again, I won't drain the rest of these, but I am going to go ahead and hand it over to Mazen, and we'll jump into the meat of this thing that everyone's probably ready to hear. So Mazen, I will kick it your way.
Thank you, Nathan, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. So we'll be talking today about market disruptions first, which is not what we were used to do, but here we are, and where do we start? So we've seen a lot of market disruptions in the last 3 months, from tariffs to fuel to carrier regulations. We'll be talking about all of these. So starting with what we saw in the freight market, we saw major disruptions there as well, especially on the spot side. The charts here show spot and contract rates for van, reefer, and flatbed in the top row, and we can see that spot rates surged by a significant amount starting in December, going into January and February, despite seasonal headwinds. So during February and March, we should expect spot rates to be decreasing, mostly for van and reefer. Instead, we saw them continue to tighten. We've seen some increases in contract rates as well, indicating that some of these increases in spot rates are not only seen as temporary, but as structural shifts in the market. We saw similar trends on the Uber Freight platform. Looking at routing guide trends, we saw a significant deterioration in routing guide compliance, which fell from about 92% or 93% a few months ago to 83% if we look at first sender acceptance rate. So a major drop there from the 90s to the low 80s. A similar drop in routing guide compliance from the 90s to the mid 80s as well. And an increase in the costs because a lot of volume was pushed into the spot market or down the routing guides. We saw increased costs that were suffered by shippers. So the primary cost over the cost over the primary carrier increased from about 1 to 2%, surging to about 8 to 9%, which is probably the highest levels we've seen since 2022. So all of these indicators are at the highest levels or at the tightest levels we've seen since 2022. Back when the market was tight, and this is running, as I said, counter to seasonal trends, where we expect the market to be softening in February and March. So what are the causes behind these disruptions? Starting with tariffs. So tariffs is not directly impacting the freight market domestically, but it has implications on broader trade. The major development there is that we've seen IEEPA tariffs getting rescinded. So most of the tariffs that were imposed on China, on Canada, Mexico, and on other countries through what was called the Liberation Day tariffs were rescinded by the Supreme Court of the US. In response to that, the Trump administration introduced a new 10% global tariff as a response to this decision. And they also indicated that they plan to increase this to 15% as well. Now, before this decision by the Supreme Court, the average tariff rate was in the mid-teens. So across all imports, across all goods, the average tariff rate paid by shippers was around like 14 to 15%. After this decision by the Supreme Court, it's now below 10%, which is good news, but still higher than what we've seen in the prior years. And assuming that the 10% global tariffs will remain in place, that will the average tariff rate will settle around 10.5%, according to some reports by the Yale Budget Lab. So how are shippers responding to this? They're shortening lead times and they're increasing spot exposure. So a lot of shippers are seeing this as a window for ordering. There's a lot of uncertainty in the tariff landscape, and some shippers are seeing this as a purchasing window. Others are not, because the new global tariff, which was supposed to replace the tariffs being removed, it will result in some discrepancies between the old tariffs and the new tariffs. So some shippers will see tariffs that are higher than where we started. Some shippers will see their tariffs getting lower. So as I said, we're seeing more spot exposure. We're seeing some hybrid contract and spot strategies. And we're seeing that shippers are trying to protect themselves against overexposure to a single trade lane. So these are all good practices. I think shippers should be monitoring exposure to different corridors, different carriers, and different ports and countries of origin, of course. Balancing contract and spot. We've seen some increase in spot rates recently, but these are mostly domestic. So there could be some room to get some benefits, either by going to contract or spot, depending on the cost trade-offs. So that's all on the tariff landscape. The last thing I want to mention here is that before this week, we didn't have clarity on the refunds, on tariff refunds. And this week, we're starting to get some clarity. Most likely these refunds will happen through the liquidation process, which takes place about 314 days after the initial payments. So please reach out to the Uber Freight team to help you with any insights or like how the process works. We have all the experts in the house. So moving to weather disruptions, this was probably the single biggest mover of the US freight market in the last couple of months. We had Winter Storm Fern, and that was followed by weather disruptions in the Northeast as well. During the last week of January and the first week of February, we saw extreme market tightening. We saw significant deterioration in routing guide trends. And we saw increased tender rejections, especially in specialized networks. So we saw tender rejections happening across van, reefer, and so on, but especially in specialized networks. As spot rates increased, carriers were shifting more to higher paying spot opportunities and rejecting more contract loads, which is typical for market tightening. And despite all of that, we've seen some shippers maintaining really ambitious service expectations. So as of now, it seems more and more clear that these changes to the market that we've seen, and they were probably triggered by weather events, will last longer than the storm itself. So the weather disruptions are mostly gone by this point, but the market remains tight, which means that there are some long-term shifts in the freight market that shippers should be accounting for. So the key actions for shippers are to build weather contingency playbooks, revisit the routing guides, look at vulnerabilities there, analyze what went wrong, and what could be improved, because shippers should be prepared to other tightening events which are expected over the coming months as we go into DOT week and summer produce season and so on. The most recent disruption, as we all know, is fuel prices. What's happening with fuel prices? Last week, we saw a significant increase in the price of diesel because of the events going on in the Middle East. Crude oil prices nearly jumped to $120 per barrel over the weekend before they decreased a little bit. The last I saw today was in the 90s, which is significantly higher than the 50s that we saw before these events in the Middle East. So how does this affect the freight market? As we all know, contract rates most of the time have a built-in fuel surcharge. Shippers should expect that portion of the cost to increase. Spot rates do not have a fuel surcharge, but carriers also try to bake in fuel as part of their cost. So we should expect also spot rates to increase as well because of fuel. And because the market is tight, carriers have more leverage than before. So it's likely that as fuel prices decrease, if they do, that spot rates will remain sticky, or will not decrease as much. As for the long-term effects, we know that fuel prices are correlated with carrier exits, especially small and medium carriers, which do not always have the option of having a separate fuel surcharge or increasing fuel by the same, or increasing their prices as much. So the chart here shows FMCSA carrier regulations shown in carrier revocations or carriers exiting the market shown in the blue line versus diesel prices shown in the black line. And we can see a very tight correlation between these two. And lastly, we'll be talking about some regulatory changes, which are also expected to have long-term effects on the freight market. The FMCSA finalized the rule for non-domiciled CDLs, which is expected to take about 200,000 drivers from the market over the course of 5 years. So the initial estimate was more aggressive. It was 2 years. And now that the FMCSA estimates that capacity will be exiting over the next 5 years, which amounts to about 40,000 carriers per year, combined with the English language proficiency rule, which we discussed last time, which is supposed to take about 20 to 25,000 drivers. It is a significant amount of capacity exiting the market. We also continue to see similar trends, as Nathan will talk about, in trucking employment. So capacity continues to exit the market because of these tightening regulations. So what we're seeing from customers, we're seeing more mini bids as customers are trying to protect themselves against like routing guide deterioration. At the same time, these cost increases might or might not be temporary. So we're seeing more reliance on mini bids. Our key recommendations for shippers are to stress test routing guides. Look at your routing guides, analyze vulnerabilities, as we said. The storm is a good indication. The storm that we saw in February is a good indication of what could happen in a tight market, which we should expect around peak season or summer peak season, as I said, which goes from early May through the DOT week until the 4th of July. So that's when we expect the market to tighten significantly based on historical trends. Of course, diversify your carrier exposure. Evaluate carrier compliance readiness. So which of your carriers are likely to be affected by these new regulations, and how to protect yourself against that. And also prepare targeted mini bids as well. So now I'll hand it over to Nathan to talk about more carrier trends, what we're seeing with small and large size carriers, and some economic trends as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mazen. I'll jump on this slide. So it's kind of funny, just a couple slides back, $120, barrel of crude. Someone asked me, I swear, like before the weekend was out, like, hey, do you think oil prices are going to go over $100 a barrel, and I was like, oh no, not for a bit. I mean, they may get there, and then come in Monday, and it's like, oh no, well, I was totally wrong on that. So yeah, really volatile space, especially in the fuel. And I do want to reiterate one point Mazen made was just like a lot of the smaller carriers who live on the spot board or live in the short-term contract, maybe pricing all in, right? And that really, when you have these big fuel spikes, that really hurts those smaller carriers from a liquidity standpoint. Just being able to, they're paying for the fuel now, they're not going to get paid for 30 to 60 days. Some of them don't have that cash float. Some have pricing in where they just didn't take into account the fuel spike. So a lot of these smaller carriers, I think, who live in that flat rate world are kind of getting impacted and are going to be going back to the shippers trying to help understand how this is going to work. So moving on to this carrier trend piece, the 194,000 drivers is a big shocking number, right? And I think when you first see it, you're like, oh my gosh. And the good thing is there's that phase in over a 4 or 5 year period. So it's not a big slug of drivers leaving. It's more of a metered approach. Saying that, like, still some major impacts upcoming, right? I think when we talk to the large fleets, so your large national name brand fleets, I'd say they're not worried. They feel good about the driver base, and that they aren't going to be impacted by a lot of these rules just due to the drivers they're using. I think a lot of the smaller carriers are concerned with kind of some of these visas, and how long can we continue to use them? Are we going to lose drivers permanently? And so you compound that with everything else we talked about with fuel and rates, and so there's a lot of carriers getting a lot of pressure on them, which is in turn driving the rate up, right? So just want to give a little bit of color around what we're hearing from the carriers, especially in this driver aspect. So two very different stories depending on the size of the carrier and the industry they're operating in. So I want to move on, just hit a couple slides on just general economic updates. I do want to remind everyone the Q&A is open, so if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A. And we'll go through those here in a little bit. We only have a few slides left, so yeah, please, if you have questions, please get those in, and we'll be sure to transition to that here in a minute. And so if you just look at overall trucking demand, spending on goods has slowed. In Q4, flat from Q3. We're still a little bit above of last year, but pair that with housing and manufacturing, you're getting some positive signs. You're getting some new home sales hit some post peaks, right? And even though nothing, even though the demand hasn't recovered fully, it sure does feel like there's a lot of signs for it, right? And we can kind of feel hopefully a little bit of a trucking recovery relief here, just due to some of these indicators and signs that we're starting to see. So kind of reading the tea leaves here, we're still projecting that there's going to be a pressure on the demand side, even though it may not be a glaring number at this point. We think it's building just due to everything we're seeing in the marketplace. And last slide we have is just a snapshot of kind of what our truck orders and the costs look like right now. So it's I'd say a lot of orders are getting put in, so it is really reflecting that optimism of that there's going to be more demand in the marketplace. So we're starting to see more orders come in. Folks are starting to plan longer term, get their orders in for 27, et cetera. The interesting thing is we just showed a bunch of headwinds on the driver's side, right? So we got a lot of tractors people are trying to buy. There's some potential headwinds on the driver's side. So, kind of opposite dynamics there. We're trying to figure out, or the carriers are trying to figure out as they buy tractors, like how to get them staffed and how to have the appropriate, driver base in them. So a very interesting, I'd say, dichotomy of different aspects of the industry that has some pressure right now. You just look at a few of the stats, like Class 8 orders are up 156%. So yeah, really getting a lot of orders put in. And then then employment obviously coming down, which is hit all over at this point. So I think that, let's see, there may be, nope, I think we are fully to our Q&A section. So please go ahead and jump in and add some questions if you have any. And so we'll maybe give it a couple minutes and see if we can get a few more in here before we get going. kind of go back through the slides a little bit, see if we can bring any questions up. So one thing that's coming through, Mazen, and maybe we'll just kind of stick on this fuel piece of what that looks like. I don't know if we've seen any projections or what this is going to look like long term, but I know we touched a little bit on what shippers should be doing. But I think some of the questions coming is like, how do I go ahead and mitigate against these fuel practices and get in front of the carriers? And maybe you and I can tag team that one a little bit. But if you wouldn't mind taking it of kind of what approach should the shippers be taking right now as they are working with the carrier base, knowing that this fuel's on the horizon?
Yeah, thanks, Nathan.
Yep.
I think it's very uncertain to predict fuel prices at this point. The latest I was looking at is the EIA forecast for diesel prices. They're expecting this to be a temporary bump. So by the end of this year, they're expecting that fuel prices will normalize or go to the levels that we've seen before. Of course, this is very uncertain at this point. So it depends on a lot of things. What will happen in the Middle East? And we don't really know how long that's going to last as well. But at least the EIA forecast is projecting normalization in fuel prices by the end of this year. What this means for shippers, I think we need to plan for the additional costs, right? So I think the key recommendation for shippers here is that this is a variable that is outside our control, and it's good to test multiple scenarios and what are the implications on our budgets and so on. It's also important to work with reliable carriers, because rising fuel prices will put a lot of pressure on carriers, especially the small and medium-sized ones. So carrier selection and routing guide design is critical here to plan around rising fuel prices as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mazen. I think just adding from my shipper hat. In some old roles, I think about when we would see these spikes in fuel, we would run a few different plays in the business, and you think of like fill rate for truckload, right? Like really trying to understand, am I filling my trucks? What are my order days? Am I ordering from the same vendor multiple times a week? What's my economic order quantity? Really trying to drive those efficiencies, so I'm not shipping extra trucks I don't need to be shipping, right? And that just exacerbates the fuel problem, and I'm already paying more in the line haul. So yeah, along with like how do we fill our trucks, the ordering, the economic order quantities, and just like working with your shippers to understand their constraints and really trying to help consolidate those shipments in will help mitigate some of those fuel pressures as well.
We can also talk about mode choice there. So whenever it's possible to convert truckload loads to intermodal, we might see some savings in fuel there as well.
Yeah, you definitely see. Typically, the intermodal fuel surcharge is around half-ish of the truckload. So yeah, you can definitely see, even with a higher line haul, when fuel spikes, it's good to do the math, because you can see like, hey, maybe this is really an intermodal shipment at this point in time, just due to the fuel pressures. I think that's a good segue too. Is there's a question on procurement in here, and I actually did forget to hit it on it a little bit, but just overall from a procurement standpoint, what are we seeing? We in the past we have been seeing kind of a like low single digit decrease in rates on some of the initial scenarios, and then we would work it way up to kind of a typical low single digit save, right? So you see the carriers, for example, come in 5%, we'd work it down to a 2% save for the shipper based on baseline. Starting this week and last week, that initial scenario of, hey, am I seeing do I have a 5% gap here in my base scenario? Like, no, it's closing, right? And so there's a lot less room to work with when the shippers are starting to see what options they have, whereas it was pretty flexible if they were just trying to base their scenarios on rate and make that decision. So yeah, it's a very interesting time, because now they just don't have the flexibility, and they don't have the options just due to the rate pressures if they're trying to save money, right? So now it's about how do they mitigate costs, how do they ensure they have enough capacity for the right time being, as they kind of work through those events. So yeah, definitely we're seeing a shift in the numbers as well. We haven't really, it's kind of on the front end, so like those aren't being implemented yet, but the pricing we're starting to get back. you can see it in the data where the pressures in the marketplace are starting to take off. Okay. And I will pause there. That was the last of our questions. We can wait another minute or so, I think. And then if folks want to go ahead and key in questions, if they have anything further, we'd be glad to wait. And if not, I'd say, please go out. Oh, here we go. We're getting some questions in. Okay. Yeah, thank y'all for putting these in. We just got a bunch of them drop in. Okay, so yeah, there's I think there was a question on intermodal. I think we hopefully hit that, right? I think the benefits to intermodal, just a little bit more depth on that. Typically you can, capacity is one thing. You can usually get the capacity on the train from the large providers. So if you're struggling for capacity, that opens up another avenue for you to just get some more of those more of that capacity in your portfolio, plus the fuel savings, right? So you're going to lose on the transit, right? So on the intermodal side, so usually you're at a longer transit. So what happens is if you consistently move that lane from truck to intermodal, you may have a safety stock issue or an inventory issue. You're going to be carrying more potentially, right? So we would always look at, okay, what's my fuel differential, line haul differential, and then can I try to place any kind of like light inventory carrying cost on it of an extra day or two of inventory on some of this stuff, and then we'd let the math kind of sort itself out, and that's really where we saw the benefit from intermodal. Do you have anything to add on that, Malzen?
Not on that, but I see we have like a couple of questions around the outlook, right? The rate outlook. So maybe we can talk about that as well. So I see there are two questions there. So hopefully we'll try to answer both. What is the outlook for rates, and what is the outlook for supply and demand dynamics? So as we mentioned before, this is mostly supply-driven recovery so far in the freight market. The market tightening has been mostly due to capacity exiting the market, whether that's due to regulations or due to organic capacity exits that were happening even before the regulations. The storm was the key event that triggered this market tightening, but the underlying factors that were driving this tightening were already there. So what this means in terms of spot and contract rates, previously last year, as I said, we were expecting the market to tighten a little bit this year, but we weren't expecting it to tighten this much. Of course, no one could have expected the storms or the regulatory changes, so that was beyond the forecast. But we were seeing some tightening on the horizon because of what we were seeing on the supply side. And now, of course, this got exacerbated by what happened within the regulatory landscape, with weather events, and now with what's happening with the fuel prices as well. So looking at where we stand right now in terms of spot and contract rate forecasts, we develop our own forecast, and we also monitor it against external forecasts. If you ask me 2 months ago, most of these spot rates forecasts were falling below the 10% year-over-year growth mark. Right now, all of them, or almost all, I think all of them are falling above the 10% mark. We've seen most of the forecasts falling within the 10% to 20% range of growth year-over-year, with a few going above 20%, expecting significant market tightening. What this means for contract rates usually lag spot rates. So if you asked me 2 months ago, our forecast for contract rates was a slight growth of 2 to 3%. And now with the increase in spot rates that is exceeding 15 to 20% so far, we're expecting contract rates to rise more than 5%, so 5 to 10% year over year at least. So that's like 5% at least, maybe is the minimum you should expect. And somewhere between 5 and 10% is where the average should fall. So of course, this remains very uncertain. We are at the time of the year, so as I mentioned, February, March to April, this is the soft period of the year. This is supposed to be the soft period of the year. Usually the market continues to fall during this time. It bottoms around April, and then we see a rebound in May. So if we're seeing this amount of tightening in the soft period of the year, we should be prepared for more tightening to come when we actually see a boost on the demand side driven by summer produce volumes. and the OT week as well. So I hope I answered these questions on the outlooks. It's very uncertain at this point, but we should be prepared for long-term rate increases both on the spot side and the contract side.
Yeah, Mazen, that's perfect. I was reading through a few of these that are coming in as well, and great questions. Keep them coming. I'm reading one of just like capacity imbalances, other regions that are getting impacted, right? And I think you hit it on the produce side of the house. Like once that ramps up, right, we're going to start seeing that tightening capacity in the Southeast. You're going to see, capacity crunches out in the West Coast. I actually. I actually got some notes from some of our senior leaders on the operations side, looking for trucks on lanes that we haven't, talked about in a long time, right? And so we're starting to see, capacity needs out of Southern California. Perfect conversation for intermodal, right? So can I shift stuff intermodally out of Southern California because I'm seeing rate pressures on those, knowing that produce season's coming up. That's just one example. It's really difficult to just forecast out every single region that's going to have impacts. But I mean, I think you can get line of sight to, like, we know produce is going to kick on. We know it's going to put a pressure on trucks, regardless of those regions. So I'd be planning accordingly there. There was one other one I wanted to touch on here. I think you hit it a little bit too, but I do want to reiterate. I think there was a good point in here. It's a very the supply and demand of the trucking market is really interesting because you have a lot of people who are kind of like buying trucks based on signals and what they think. I feel like we're a little more informed than they are. But I think the question was like, hey, everybody's buying these trucks. Are we sure this is going to really tighten up? And I'd say folks are sure enough to be at least putting the orders in. And I wouldn't say anything that would deter anyone from thinking that way either. It certainly feels like it's time from the carriers to start either replacing trucks, add new, like they're going to have to start getting these orders in just to prepare for a cycle, even if it's down the road. To Mazen's point, like we don't see anything that's going to change the projections, right? We still think there's going to be some increasing cost on throughout the year, which kind of leads me to another question that popped in was like, hey, like should I still do my procurement event like I had scheduled, or should I, hold off? And I'd say, like, in an increasing, freight market, if we feel it's going to be increasing and you feel the freight market's going to be increasing in your business, like it'd be, good to go ahead and get that RFP out on the street to hedge against, later increasing prices. So I think waiting in this market, maybe not the play. You could try to go and extend some of your critical lanes with some of your core providers if you feel that would be a fruitful avenue. You could try to some pre-negotiations on that standpoint to try to mitigate some of those increases. But just from an overall event standpoint, if your rates are stale, then I'd go ahead and let's start making some plans to try to get that out on the street and get some rates secured before things really, really take off and pressure kicks in, do all the things we talked about.
I also wanted to follow up on the question regarding tractor orders. So whether these reflect actually optimism or other indications. So tractor orders usually follow spot rates, and we've seen a tight correlation between carrier orders and tractor orders and spot rates. Over the last 3 years or so, when the market was in a freight recession, we've seen very low amount of tractor orders. So even 2024 and 2025 were lower than most of the previous years that we've seen, even getting lower than the 2020 and 2021 levels, where the orders were constrained actually by supply rather than demand. So we've seen carriers very hesitant to place orders over the last few years. This is currently reflected in low tractor sales. So there's a lead time between tractor orders and tractor sales of about 4 to 6 months. In tight markets, it can get longer. When carriers place orders, they usually receive the trucks after a few months. And we start seeing the effect on the freight market in another 5 to 6 months. So tractor orders, we think of it as a very early indicator of what happens in the freight market by at least like 1 year lag or so. So right now we are seeing a very low amount of tractor sales, reflecting the weak tractor orders that we saw last year and the year before. But given the recent surge in spot rates in December going into January and February, we saw a similar surge in tractor orders. Now, a lot of this reflects, as we said, carrier optimism. So carriers are optimistic in a market turn. They finally see some signals that this is happening, and they're placing these orders to be ready for the increased demand. But as I said, this will not probably have effects on the freight market in 2026. Mostly it's a 2027 story because of the long lead times. So not all of this is optimism. A lot of carrier orders were also driven by the upcoming EPA regulations, which are supposed to increase the prices of tractors. Maybe like 8,000 to 10,000 are the ranges that I've seen. So carriers are trying to get ahead of these changes of these regulations. But given that we saw a very tight correlation between spot rates and tractor orders, given that December was the month where we saw a surge in spot rates and a surge in tractor orders, it's more likely that this reflects carrier optimism rather than the effect of the regulations.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Miles. And I'll touch on one more here that I think is interesting. So there was a question on just routing guides. I know we touched briefly on those, and how do you stress test them? How do you make sure they're kind of ready for kind of what's coming? And I'd say there's probably no real way to just run a test on them. But what we always try to communicate is make sure it's a solid plan and has some good depth in it, right? So in looser markets like we're coming out of, we in a lot of cases you could put a single primary carrier and then kind of let it roll to the next cheapest person after that, and just let it be a kind of a low cost solution after your primary, which works great, in a loose market because there's plenty of capacity and folks are taking things to spot and whatever they get their hands on. An increasing type market playbook is okay. So how do we put our core carriers into the routing guide to protect those initial rejects and keep it from falling straight through and spinning in the routing guide, right? Of course, cost is a factor. So it's how do you stack up your core providers into the routing guide versus just a single or two carriers and letting it go to backup or whatever it may be. So recommendation wise is make sure you have your core carriers in the routing guide in their key regions, and make sure it's have some depth to it too, right? You don't need 100 carriers on it, but you probably don't need 2. So just kind of make sure you have the right depth and feel good about the majority of your routing guide. And then I'd say have a good low volume plan as well, as you start to see those shipments that may not hit a broader routing guide, that maybe they ship once a month or once every 2 months, that may just kind of fall through. So keep an eye on those too as well, because those can add up. But the routing guide piece is really about how do you get it strong enough to where when the first few folks reject, you can still try to get it covered by some of your core players. Okay.
There's one more question about the imbalances in the freight network and where we're seeing the market tightening versus not. So any specific lanes, any specific regions. Maybe I can start with that, and Nathan, feel free to add it as well, add your thoughts as well. In the last couple of months, we've seen most of the disruptions were led by weather events. So we've seen tightness following these weather events. So a month ago, we were seeing extreme tightening in the Midwest. After that, it was followed by tightening in the Northeast. But then as these disruptions were mitigated, we saw the market continue to tighten nationally all over the US. So now if you look at some market indicators like tender rejections or spot rates, or if you look at any market indicators, we see that they're tight almost across the US, with one exception, which is the West region. So we see maybe the softest growth in year-over-year spot rates in the West region. My guess is that this is not because this year is particularly weak for the West region, but because last year was stronger than other regions. So the year-over-year comps are skewed there. And the reason is that the West region is more exposed to imports. Last year, we saw a lot of pre-stocking ahead of tariffs, which propped up rates in that region. But then as imports decreased after tariffs were actually implemented, this region is now seeing less growth in spot rates year over year compared to other regions. Add to that this region was not as affected or not as hit by weather events as other regions. But to summarize, we're expecting the market to remain tighter than last year across all regions. we're expecting spot rates to be positive year over year across all regions in the US.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Mazen. What a change a quarter makes, huh? Like it's don't go back and replay the last the Q4 one because it was very, very different, very much of the same. It's kind of interesting how quick the which is great. So yeah, I think we've exhausted most of the questions or tried to hit on topics. But again, really appreciate your time. Look for the broader report. It has a lot of great stuff in it, a lot of deep dives into the different countries we operate in, as well as all the different modes. So Mazen, thank you so much for your time, and folks who joined the call and spent their lunch with us or early afternoon, mid morning. Just appreciate y'all, and reach out to your Uber Freight contact if you have any questions or anything sparked any ideas to talk about your business. So again, thanks everybody, and really appreciate it. And let us know if you need anything.